Dr. Lennox, you wrote this book, Gunning for God. First of all, we talked about this book on the program before. We got maybe about 10% through it. There's so much in the book. But refresh our listeners a little bit. Why did you write it, and what really is this book about overall?
I wrote it because I noticed there was a second stream, really, of vigorous objection to the Christian faith coming from the new atheists. Their first attack is at the scientific level, the idea that science has buried God and so on. And I wrote my first book in response to that, God's Undertaker, Has Science Buried God? But I noticed increasingly, particularly with Christopher Hitchens, that the objections were coming in terms of morality, that Hitchens felt that, for instance, the doctrine of the atonement was moral, or the biblical morality was absurd or evil, and so on. And you got these repetitions of phrases like Dawkins saying, the God of the Old Testament is the most pestilential. You know, this kind of thing that people like repeating. And I thought, this is probably quite disturbing to many Christian thinkers. How are we going to respond to it? So I started putting a few ideas together, and it grew into this book, Gunning for God, which some people said is not the best title for an Irishman to come up with. And, of course, it's an ambiguous title. There are the people who take up weapons, literally, to gun for God and to try to defend Christianity that way. And, of course, that's a disaster. But then the reaction to that is gunning for God. That is the atheist trying to shoot God down. So it was to try to take a long look at some of the arguments that are being used in the general moral sphere.
It's very well done, and I know you've noticed this because you've written it in your book. But I notice it going college campus to college campus. In fact, I was just in Michigan last week, and I asked a question of atheists who come back at me with objection after objection and don't really listen to the answer. I usually ask them this question: if Christianity were true, would you become a Christian? And on several occasions, I've had people yell at me, no. Now, I ask them, how is that rational? You claim to be an atheist, a beacon of reason, and I ask you, if something were true, would you believe it? And you say no. I think the elephant in the room is morality and accountability. They don't want it to be true. And in your book, Gunning for God, John, you have a section in there where you're talking about, and I believe it is on page, let me get this because it's important. You are talking about how the atheists seem to be avoiding morality. They seem to be avoiding God. Let me find it because it was a great portion here. You talk about it being the opium of the masses on page 47 here, that it's been commonly said. I think Mark said something like religion is the opium of the masses. But I think you point out that atheism can be the opiate of some people. For what reason?
Well, this is the famous psychological objection that goes essentially back to Freud.
Yeah.
You know, your belief in God and heaven is really pie in the sky when we die.
Right.
And it's a projection of your desire for comfort and security and so on and so forth. And that objection is used by many people until today. And I came across a very interesting book, which is a bestseller in Germany by a man called Manfred Lutz, who's a very well-known psychiatrist. And the book is called Eine kleine Geschichte des Größten, a brief history of the Great One, meaning God. And he made what, to my mind, was a very powerful point. He put it more sharply than I'd ever heard it before. And he put it this way. He said, look, if there is no God, then, of course, Freud gives you a brilliant argument why religion of all kinds, and Christianity in particular, is wish fulfillment and so on, if there is no God. But he said, of course, if there is a God, Freud will give you an equally convincing argument that atheism is an escape mechanism, a desire not to have to meet God and so on. And there's a Polish Nobel laureate for literature, Czesław Miłosz, and he wrote a very interesting parallel to the Marxian statement, the opium of the people. He said a true opium of the people is a belief in nothingness after death, a huge solace of thinking that for our betrayals, greed, cowardice, murders, we are not going to be judged. So if God does exist, atheism can equally well be seen to be a psychological escape mechanism to avoid, as you said, taking ultimate responsibility for life. And then the author, Manfred Lutz, presses his point. If there is no God, Freud's argument is great against religion. If there is a God, Freud's argument is great against atheism. But as to whether there is a God or not, Freud can't help you at all. And I think that's enormously important, that because the argument is equally balanced and two-edged, it decides nothing. But the atheists often put it as if it has only one side to it, you see.
Well, I saw Christopher Hitchens, and I know you've had the opportunity to interact with him. I had the opportunity to debate him a couple of times as well, and he really just seemed mad at God. And he even says in his book that it's an enormous relief to him to know that there's nobody that's going to judge him after death. And as we all know, tragically, he died back about a year ago in December, sadly. But I find that when I go to a college campus, and I know you've seen it too, they don't push back much on the cosmological argument. They don't seem to push back on the fine-tuning of the universe, but everybody pushes back on morality.
Oh, yes. I think that's right. And I often say to people that the human person is complex. We are rational beings, and rational argument is important. But an old Irish farmer once taught me something very important. And he said, you know, John, he said, if a man can't see reason, reason isn't his problem. And so when I find people coming back at me irrationally, I begin to suspect that the problem lies usually in the area of the will. And people don't want there to be a God. Now, of course, that is now no longer in the realm of science at all. They prefer that there's no God, or they don't wish there to be a God. And of course, that is the moral argument. And the New Testament makes it very clear that human beings are in rebellion against God. It's good to see that they're honest about this, because that shows where the problem really lies. But then they needn't pretend. It's lack of rational argument. It's unwillingness to follow the evidence where it leads because it makes moral demands.
In fact, Thomas Nagel was very clear about that. He said, it's not just that I don't believe in God. He said, I don't want there to be a God. And
yes, that's right.
And he said that he thought Hitchens and Dawkins had this cosmic authority problem. Of course, the sword cuts both ways, I think, Dr. Lennox. I think you might agree that a lot of Christians just believe there's a God because they want to believe there's a God.
Sure, absolutely. So, and I'm glad you emphasize that we must get beyond this simple emotional needs fulfillment argument. If there is a God and he's real, well then, of course, it is a tremendous comfort. But as Dawkins says, the fact that it's a comfort doesn't make it real. Or true. And I said to him, Richard, that's exactly right, but it doesn't make it false either. You almost detect sometimes with Dawkins that he thinks that because it satisfies a need, it must be false. But half a minute, human beings have a need for water.
And it's there.
And it's there.
That's right.
And they've needs for all other kinds. And one might mount a little bit of an argument saying it would be very surprising in a world where there seems to be a deep-seated need for transcendence, that it's not there. And one of the very exciting developments I've come across since I was last with you, and I've been discussing this, and it's the subject of a book by our present chief rabbi, Jonathan Sachs. But it's about the two halves of the brain. And there's a book by Ian McGilchrist that is called The Master and His Emissary. And the basic thesis of the book is utterly fascinating. Since we're talking about psychology and Freud, it might be worth having a brief look at this.
Sure, go ahead.
But the basic idea is that The Master's Emissary is a story by Nietzsche. The boss of a little country was very wise and so on, and so the country expanded, and he began to need emissaries, ambassadors, so he sent them out, and all was well for a while, until one of the emissaries got it into his head that he was as good as the master. So he took over, but because he wasn't as wise and experienced, he destroyed the place. That's the story. Now, Ian McGilchrist, who's a psychiatrist, he says that the master is the right-hand side of the brain. the emissary is the left-hand side. And he's very careful in his book to point out, of course, both sides of the brain interact and they can more or less do the same things. Mm-hmm. But there are differences. And roughly speaking, the left side of the brain deals with analysis, measurement, mm-hmm. science, rationality, and so on. Mm-hmm. The right side, though, deals with integration, terms of person, seeing the big picture. Now he makes this point. Since the Enlightenment, we have emphasized the left side of the brain to the neglect of the right-hand side. And that's why we're in such confusion at every level. Because, and this is now coming from psychology and psychiatry, that's why it fascinates me, the human being needs transcendence. And needs a big picture and needs integration. And I found that utterly fascinating because here's a result of what broadly could be called a scientific bit of research.
Right.
And it's saying, look, you're concentrating on one half without the other.
Isn't it interesting that theology used to be seen as the queen of the sciences, that all truth would come under this one rubric?
Right.
And now we're so specialized in these disciplines, these narrow disciplines, that we can't see the big picture anymore.
Yes, that's right. We split the thing up. It's reductionist. That's the key word in this. And it's not integrative.